Have you ever noticed how some people move through life without background music, as if silence follows them like a shadow that doesn't frighten them at all? No playlist playing on repeat, no songs that define entire eras of their life, no lyrics rising up at 2 in the morning to remind them of someone they lost or something they never said. While the world around you seems to breathe through headphones and speakers, they sit in the quiet, unbothered, almost untouched by the emotional gravity music has over everyone else. You live in a culture that treats music like emotional oxygen. We use it to grieve, to fall in love, to remember who we were when life felt simpler. A song can reopen a wound or heal it in seconds. It can transport you back into a room you thought you escaped years ago, and yet there are people who don't cling to it. They don't anchor their memories to melodies or regulate their emotions through sound. They hear music, they may even enjoy it, but it doesn't possess them. It doesn't become a language they rely on to feel alive. At first glance, that difference can feel unsettling. You might wonder if something is missing, if there's an emotional depth they lack, or a sensitivity they never developed. But this silence isn't a flaw. It isn't about intelligence, creativity, or even emotional capacity. It's about wiring, about how emotions learn to move inside you when you were too young to name them, and how your nervous system learned to cope before the world handed you tools like playlists and lyrics. Imagine a child sitting alone in a room, not because they're abandoned, but because they learned early how to sit with themselves. No one teaches them to drown feelings in noise. No one hands them a soundtrack for sadness or joy. Their emotions rise and fall internally, unamplified, unshared. Over time, that child grows into an adult who doesn't reach outward when something stirs inside them. They don't need sound to translate feeling. Silence already speaks fluently. Psychology tells us that some people regulate emotion externally, while others do it inwardly. Neuroscience shows that music activates powerful dopamine and memory circuits, but not all brains rely on that stimulation to feel grounded. For some, emotional processing happens quietly, in thought, in sensation, in stillness. Their attachment to sound was never formed because their attachment to self had to develop early. This isn't a judgment, it's an excavation. A careful lowering into the quiet spaces most people rush to fill, because this difference didn't appear overnight. It began long before adulthood, before taste, before identity, before you knew what music was supposed to mean. And to understand it, you have to go back to where silence first learned how to feel safe. Did you grow up in a house where silence wasn't empty, but simply normal? Where emotions weren't wrapped in lullabies, car radios, or songs played to soften the edges of a hard day? Some children don't remember music as comfort. They remember rooms, the weight of still air, the quiet hum of a fan late at night. And in that quiet, they learn something early. Feelings were something you handled alone. Picture a child sitting on the floor, toys scattered, the television off, no music filling the space between moments. The house isn't cruel, just emotionally neutral. Or maybe it's loud in all the wrong ways. Arguments, instructions, urgency, but never attuned. No one mirrors the child's inner world back to them. No one says, I see how you feel. Attachment theory tells us that when emotional mirroring is inconsistent or absent, a child adapts, not by collapsing, but by containing. They learn to hold emotions inside like water in cupped hands, careful not to spill, careful not to ask for help that never quite arrives. In some homes, music becomes a bridge. Parents sing to regulate, to soothe, to bond. In others, there is no soundtrack for sadness or joy, and so the child becomes their own regulator. Neuroscience shows that emotional self-soothing can develop internally when external regulation is limited. The brain builds quiet pathways instead of loud ones. Feelings are processed through thought, tension, imagination, or stillness, not through sound. This is where the difference begins. While other children attach memories to melodies, you attach them to sensations. The feeling of the couch fabric under your fingers, the way light fell through a window during an afternoon that never quite ended. Music, when it appears, feels optional, pleasant maybe, but unnecessary. You don't need it to translate your emotions because you were never taught that emotions required translation. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional independence that looks like maturity from the outside. You don't fall apart easily, you don't reach for noise when something hurts, but there's a shadow here too. A garden that learned to survive without water doesn't bloom the same way. The absence of music isn't emptiness, it's restraint, a quiet discipline learned too early. Many people who obsess over music are not shallow, they are regulating. Songs become safe containers for feelings they never learned to hold alone. But when that need never formed, it tells a different story. One of early self-reliance, of emotional armor built before it was needed. And that armor doesn't disappear with the age, it grows with you. What began as a child's way of surviving quietly becomes an adult's way of moving through the world, still, composed, and often misunderstood. Have you ever noticed how, as an adult, you can move through entire days without needing sound to hold you together? While others reach for headphones the moment silence appears, you let the quiet stay. Music isn't absent from your life. You may enjoy it, appreciate it, even admire it, but it doesn't attach itself to you. It doesn't become an extension of your identity or a container for your emotions. You feel without translation, as if your inner world speaks a language that doesn't require melody. This early pattern doesn't disappear with age, it simply puts on a mask. In adulthood, it looks like long drives where the radio stays off, not out of sadness, but comfort. It looks like working in silence while others insist they need background noise to focus, to feel human, to stay regulated. It looks like moments of grief, joy, or change unfolding without a song to mark them, without a soundtrack to give them shape. You experience life directly, unfiltered, as if emotions arrive raw instead of dressed in harmony. To people around you, this can be confusing. In relationships, someone might ask what song reminds you of them, and you hesitate, not because they don't matter, but because love didn't arrive to you as a melody. It arrived as presence, as consistency, as the feeling of being able to breathe around someone. And yet, without the cultural signals others expect, your inner depth can be mistaken for emotional distance. The mask forms quietly. You learn that it's easier to seem detached than to explain a way of feeling that doesn't fit the script. Psychologically, this makes sense. Attachment theory suggests that people who learn to self-regulate early often don't rely on external tools to process emotion. Neuroscience shows that while music strongly activates memory and dopamine circuits, some nervous systems don't need that stimulation to feel grounded. Your brain learned to process internally, through thought, sensation, and stillness, rather than through sound. What looks like calm independence is often emotional efficiency, but every mask casts a shadow. There are moments when this self-containment feels like strength, and moments when it feels like isolation. You might sit next to someone crying to a song that breaks them open, while you feel everything quietly, deeply without spectacle. You're not numb, you're not cold, you're just alone with it. A garden without water doesn't die, but it grows differently, and sometimes others mistake that difference for emptiness. So the question lingers beneath the surface of your adult life. Is this calm independence something you were born with? A temperament written into your nervous system? Or is it something your brain learned to become, reinforced over time by silence, adaptation, and survival? To answer that, you have to look closer, not at behavior, but at biology. What if the reason music never became your emotional lifeline isn't philosophical at all, but biological? What if your brain simply learned a different way to feel? Neuroscience tells us that emotions don't arrive as feelings first. They arrive as signals, electrical patterns, chemical shifts, and the way your brain learns to regulate those signals early on determines whether you reach outward for stimulation or inward for control. For many people, music acts like an emotional amplifier. It floods the brain's dopamine pathways, links memory to melody, and gives shape to feelings that otherwise feel too large or too vague. Studies show that music activates the limbic system, especially areas tied to reward and emotional memory. That's why a song can collapse time, pulling someone back into a breakup, a childhood summer, or a moment of loss in seconds. But not every nervous system needs that amplification to function. Some brains develop stronger internal soothing mechanisms. Instead of regulating emotion through sound, They do it through cognition, bodily awareness, or quiet narrative processing. Psychologists call this internal self-regulation. Attachment research suggests that when a child learns early to manage feelings without consistent external comfort, the brain adapts by building inward pathways. Over time, those pathways become efficient. You don't need noise to calm the storm because the storm learned how to pass quietly. Temperament plays a role too. Introversion, low sensory seeking traits, and reduced sensitivity to external stimulation all shape how you experience the world. For someone with low sensory hunger, music doesn't feel like oxygen. It feels like decoration. Pleasant, but unnecessary. Your emotional world already has structure. You don't need sound to tell you what to feel or when to feel it. There's also something called emotional granularity, the ability to experience emotions with precision rather than intensity. Research shows that people with high emotional granularity don't rely as heavily on external cues to understand what they're feeling. They can sit with discomfort, name it internally, and let it move through them. Music, for them, isn't a translator, it's optional. Their inner narrative is already fluent, but science doesn't romanticize this difference. It simply explains it. Because internal regulation, while efficient, can become isolating. When your emotions stay inside, others don't always see them. In relationships, partners may mistake your quiet processing for distance. They reach for shared playlists, emotional songs, sonic rituals of closeness, and you stand there, present but untranslated. The mask forms again, calm on the surface, complexity underneath. This is where psychology meets culture. When a society assumes that depth must be expressed loudly, through music, art, sound, it creates a narrow definition of feeling. And those who feel deeply in silence begin to question themselves, not because something is wrong, but because their biology doesn't match the expectation. So the real question isn't whether your way of feeling is valid. It's this: what happens when a world addicted to emotional noise encounters someone who feels most alive in quiet? What happens when the silence that once felt like safety slowly turns into a wall you can't climb over? At some point, emotional independence can harden into something else entirely. The quiet stops being a choice and starts becoming a refuge you hide inside. A room so still you can hear your own thoughts echo back at you, louder than any song ever could. What once protected you now keeps others out. You might remember being a child who learned to stay composed, who didn't cry loudly, who didn't need soothing through sound. That skill followed you into adulthood and became a kind of armor. Silence became proof of control, of strength, of not needing anything from anyone. But armor, when worn too long, doesn't just stop arrows, it dulls sensation. You begin to mistake numbness for peace, distance for maturity. In moments when emotion threatens to overflow, you retreat inward. You don't reach for music to open the feeling or give it shape. You don't let a song break you open in front of anyone. Instead, you tighten the mask and let the feeling pass in isolation. Psychology calls this avoidant regulation, a strategy rooted in attachment patterns where vulnerability once felt unsafe. Neuroscience shows that repeated emotional suppression can reduce emotional reactivity over time, not because the feelings disappear, but because the brain learns to mute them. This is where the shadow lives. Silence becomes a way to avoid being seen. You might tell yourself you don't need music because you're strong, because you're self-sufficient, because you don't rely on external crutches. But sometimes, underneath that story, there's fear. Fear that if you let sound in, something fragile might surface. A memory, a grief, a longing you've kept buried because you learned early that no one was coming to hold it with you. In relationships, this shadow grows heavier. A partner plays a song that makes them cry, and you sit beside them, present but sealed. They may feel alone with their emotion, and you may feel misunderstood in your stillness. Resentment can grow on both sides. They think you're distant. You think they're overwhelming. Neither of you is wrong. You're just speaking different emotional languages. The paradox is cruel. The very strength that helped you survive now risks disconnecting you from intimacy. The garden that learned to grow without water is alive, but dry. It hasn't forgotten how to bloom. It just doesn't trust rain anymore. And from the outside, people don't see the restraint or the history behind it. They see coldness, indifference, emotional absence. This is where the story stops being only about you, because the deeper shadow isn't just internal, it's cultural. A world that worships loud feeling often misreads quiet depth, and that misunderstanding shapes how you're seen, judged, and pushed further into silence. Have you ever noticed how the world seems uncomfortable with silence, as if quiet itself is something to be fixed? Everywhere you turn, emotion is expected to announce itself loudly. Breakups demand songs that shatter you. Healing comes with playlists titled Rebirth or Revenge. Motivation is packaged in anthems that promise transformation in 3 minutes or less. In this world, feeling deeply is often confused with feeling loudly, and anything quieter is treated with suspicion. You grow up absorbing this message without realizing it. A child watches others cry to songs, celebrate with music, grieve through sound. Over time, an unspoken rule forms. If you don't react the same way, something must be missing. If a song doesn't undo you, maybe your heart isn't wired correctly. And so, even as an adult, you may catch yourself wondering if your inner stillness makes you less human, less emotional, less alive. In relationships, this conditioning cuts deepest. Someone you love sends you a song and waits for it to mean what it means to them. They want shared language, shared volume. When you don't respond with the expected emotional intensity, they may feel rejected. You may feel exposed, not because you don't care, but because your care doesn't perform. You don't bleed on cue. You don't outsource feeling to sound. And slowly, a quiet resentment can form on both sides. One person feeling unseen, the other feeling falsely judged. Psychologically, culture rewards external expression. Studies show that societies often equate emotional health with expressiveness, even though neuroscience tells a more complex story. Some nervous systems process emotion inwardly, through reflection and internal narrative rather than outward release. Attachment styles shape this too. Those who learned early to self-soothe without consistent external regulation often carry that inward style into adulthood. But culture doesn't ask how you feel, it asks how loudly you show it. This is where the myth takes root, the idea that depth must make noise, that stillness is emptiness, that silence is avoidance. Philosophy has warned us about this for centuries. Stillness has always been mistaken for absence by those who fear what rises when the noise stops. A garden without water doesn't look dramatic, but its roots may run deeper. A lake without waves still holds vastness beneath the surface. Yet living against the grain of emotional noise has consequences. You may start wearing a mask to reassure others, nodding along, pretending certain songs move you more than they do, or you retreat further into yourself, letting the shadow grow heavier, telling yourself it's easier to stay misunderstood than to explain a language no one was taught to hear. This gap between who you are inside and what the world expects you to be doesn't stay theoretical. It becomes emotional weight. And that weight, left unnamed, begins to shape your inner life in ways you don't immediately see. Ways that slowly turn difference into doubt and quiet into loneliness. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt invisible, not because you lacked emotion, but because no one knew how to read yours? Over time, a quiet story begins to follow you. Cold, distant, detached. Words people use when they can't hear what you feel because it doesn't announce itself. And you carry those labels silently, wondering when depth became something that had to perform to be believed. As a child, you learn to feel without spectacle. As an adult, that skill becomes a double-edged blade. In emotionally expressive spaces where feelings spill out through music, tears, and sound, you stand there fluent in another language. You care deeply, sometimes overwhelmingly so, but your care doesn't rise to the surface the way others expect. It stays inside, rich and layered, like a library no one thinks to enter because the doors are closed. Loneliness grows here, but not the obvious kind. You may have people around you, relationships, conversations, shared time. Yet there's a specific ache that comes from not being translated, from watching someone mistake your stillness for absence, from hearing, "You don't feel things the way I do," when what they mean is, you don't show them the way I need. Neuroscience reminds us that emotional expression varies wildly across nervous systems, but labels don't care about biology. They stick anyway. In relationships, this misunderstanding can cut deep. A partner might accuse you of not caring enough, of being emotionally unavailable, while inside you're holding more than you know how to release. Resentment quietly takes root. You begin to doubt your own inner reality. Maybe I'm broken. Maybe I'm missing something everyone else has. This is the monster within, not the absence of emotion, but the slow erosion of trust in your own way of being. Attachment theory explains part of this pain. Those with inward regulation styles often feel unseen in environments that reward outward expression. You're not disconnected, you're contained. But containment, when unrecognized, starts to feel like exile. You stop trying to explain yourself. You wear the mask more tightly. You nod along when people describe emotional highs you don't share and emotional rituals you don't need. Each time, a small part of you retreats further into the shadow. And yet, beneath that silence, there is richness, thoughtful reflection, quiet empathy, a capacity to sit with others without drowning in noise. Like a garden without water, your emotions don't bloom loudly, but they are deeply rooted. They grow slowly, privately, and because they aren't visible, they are often overlooked. The tragedy isn't that you feel differently, it's that you begin to believe those differences make you less loving, less alive, less human. Awareness is the turning point here, not the need to change, but the courage to recognize that being misunderstood does not mean being empty. And before healing can begin, the truth has to be seen, first by you. What if the answer was never to become louder, but to stop apologizing for being quiet? Healing doesn't begin with fixing yourself. It begins with permission, permission to recognize that the way you feel is not incomplete simply because it doesn't resemble the emotional performances you see around you. Somewhere along the way, you were taught, subtly or directly, that depth must look a certain way. That expression must be visible to be valid, and the first step forward is releasing that lie. As a child, you learn to translate emotion inward. As an adult, that skill can be honored instead of erased. Psychology tells us that emotional health isn't measured by intensity, but by awareness. Studies on emotional granularity show that being able to name feelings internally, even without expressing them outwardly, builds resilience and clarity. You don't need a song to tell you you're sad. You feel it in your chest, in your breathing, in the way your thoughts slow down. That awareness is not lesser, it's simply quieter. The path forward is not about imitation. You don't need to borrow someone else's emotional language to be understood. Some people speak through sound, others through movement, reflection, silence, or creation. For you, emotion might arrive as thought, as insight, as a sudden need for stillness. When you stop forcing expression that doesn't fit, something softens, the mask loosens, the monster within, the fear of being wrong, loses its grip. In relationships, this reframing changes everything. You don't need to perform feeling to earn connection. You can begin to communicate difference instead of defending it, not with explanations that sound like excuses, but with quiet clarity. This is how I feel. This is how I process. This is what care looks like in my body. Neuroscience reminds us that nervous systems vary, and intimacy doesn't require sameness, only understanding. Boundaries around emotional expectations aren't walls, they're translations. There may still be moments of loneliness, moments when silence feels heavy instead of peaceful. But now, that loneliness isn't fused with shame. You no longer assume something is missing inside you. The garden without water doesn't need to bloom like everyone else's to be alive. It just needs the right conditions to grow in its own way. This practical path isn't dramatic. It won't make noise. It won't come with an anthem or a soundtrack. It comes with self-trust, with choosing to stay present in your own emotional language rather than abandoning it for approval. And when you do that, something deeper begins to emerge. Not a louder version of you, but a truer one. From here, the question is no longer psychological. It becomes philosophical. If wholeness doesn't require performance, and depth doesn't require noise, then what does it really mean to live a full emotional life? Have you ever wondered why the deepest moments of your life rarely announce themselves? How the most important realizations don't arrive with sound, but with stillness? There is a lie woven quietly through modern life that to feel deeply, you must feel loudly. That emotion must echo to be real. But some truths are too dense for noise. They settle instead. They stay. You may have noticed this in yourself long before you had words for it. As a child, when you felt something heavy and didn't cry out. As an adult, when joy didn't explode, but warmed you slowly from the inside. In relationships, when love wasn't fireworks or songs on repeat, but presence. Showing up, staying, holding space without spectacle. To the outside world, this can look like absence, but inside it is fullness without overflow. Philosophy has always understood what psychology is only beginning to articulate. Silence is not the opposite of feeling. It is often the container for it. The shadow is not emptiness. It is depth unlit. A lake without waves still holds its vastness. A garden without water still grows, just quietly, just differently. And the monster within, the fear that you are missing something, only exists because you were taught to measure yourself by volume. Neuroscience tells us that not all nervous systems seek stimulation to feel alive. Some are built for integration rather than expression, for containment rather than release. Attachment theory reminds us that early emotional environments shape how closeness feels. For you, intimacy may never have needed sound as a bridge. You didn't need music to reach yourself. You were already there, and yet the world keeps asking you to prove it, to translate your depth into a language it recognizes, to justify your stillness, to apologize for your quiet. Over time, this pressure can create loneliness, not because you lack connection, but because your connection is invisible to those who only look for noise. That loneliness is real. It deserves compassion, but it does not mean you are unfinished. There is a different way to see yourself, one that doesn't require correction or performance, one that understands that some people are not moved by music because they move from somewhere deeper. Their emotions don't need to be summoned. They are always present, always listening, always contained. So let this be the thought that stays with you after the screen goes dark. Silence is not what's left when nothing is playing. Silence is what holds everything together. Not everyone needs music to feel alive. Some people don't listen to the music. Some people are the music.